Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. So I have a pet peeve that stems from being both an equestrian and having a background in EEOB. Now that stands for Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology. And this specific pet peeve is something that I've noticed going around in the equestrian world a bit, and it's using the term domesticated to refer to only the horses that can be found in a stable, and using the term wild to refer to anything else as opposed to the term feral, and implying that these horses are not part of the domesticated classification just because they haven't grown up around people. I'm fully expecting some feathers to be ruffled here, but please hear me out and let's get into this.
Action.
Before we really dive into this topic, I highly encourage you to please comment down below on this one to keep this conversation going, because I am genuinely interested in hearing what people have to say about this, even if your knee-jerk reaction is to just be mad at me. But again, please hear me out before making a snap judgment here. So let's get into the big topic here. And first we're going to start with the question, what does domesticated mean? And if you do a quick Google search right now, you will bring up something along the lines of this. And this definition says, of an animal tame and kept as a pet or on a farm, of a plant cultivated for food, naturalized. And the problem with this definition is it's not exactly wrong, but it's not exactly correct anyway. But it's probably closer to being wrong because of its simplicity than it is to being correct. So domestication is essentially using artificial selection, which is basically just selective breeding, to produce organisms with desirable traits. Now, we see this in crops such as corn, and this has been done to produce more and larger fruit on each plant. Yes, what we eat is technically a fruit and a grain. Plants are weird. That's not the point of this video. We also see this with ornamental plants such as roses that have been selected for these aesthetically pleasing qualities. So domesticating plants is not just about food production, it's also about these aesthetic qualities that we use for decoration. And that brings us to animals. And domestication has obviously been used on farm animals like sheep to select for the production of more wool. It's been used in dairy animals, cattle, and goats to produce more milk. But it's also being done on our dogs and cats to produce our dogs and cats. And one big thing about domesticating anything is that it's going to take place over many generations, and in some cases can end up resulting in a new species or subspecies. And then domesticated species may be able to interbreed with wild counterparts, but most of the time you're going to find that hybrids may or may not be healthy or able to reproduce themselves. But we're not going to get into domestication more than that, mainly because it is a little bit more intricate than that. But the point is, it takes place over many generations. It's not just to produce food, and an animal doesn't stop being technically a domesticated animal just because it's not living on a farm or in a house. What exactly is wild and what exactly is feral? So wild basically means that the animal in question, and we're not going to be talking about plants anymore, we're just going to talk about animals. You wouldn't technically use feral talking about plants anyway. I just feel like we need to clarify that right now. Back to what I was saying. Wild basically means that the animal in question descends from populations that have not undergone any form of domestication. That is, humans have not worked on their genetics in any way for the purpose of domesticating that animal. Of course, you have to put a little asterisk here in that we do have wild animals that are reintroduced populations that have been bred in captivity for conservation's sake. And that's not the same as breeding an animal in captivity for the purpose of bringing out a specific quality to benefit humanity for one reason or another. It's different. I think this is a point that some people try to be like, aha, on some things, but specifically, no. The animal has not undergone domestication, and none of their ancestors have either. So it's wild, whether or not it's from a very endangered population that had to be bred in captivity for conservation purposes, then reintroduced. That brings us to what is feral then? Well, basically, feral is indicating that the animal in question descends from domesticated animals. So it can be many generations from the founders of that feral population, but they still descend from domesticated animals. So these are the things that we need to remember. Domesticating something takes place over many generations, and it's done through the use of artificial selection or selective breeding. Wild means that the animal descends from animals that have not undergone this process of domestication, and feral means that the animal has descended from domesticated animals, so they are still a member of this domesticated species and or subspecies. Now let's take what we know and move on to family Equiday. In the family Equiday, you will find one extant genus, and that is the genus Equus. Now, before we move on, extant just means living, so the genus is not extinct. Extant, still alive. Don't get too hung up on that. And in this genus Equus, we find zebras, of which there are 3 extant species. Donkeys also has 3 extant species, and horses. Now, when we talk about horses, there's one extant species, Equus ferus, with 2 extant and 1 extinct subspecies. At this point, we're going to focus on horses from here on out because I'm specifically referring to horses, and when you get into talking about donkeys specifically, it gets a little more fuzzy because even within the same species, you have feral and wild populations, and it's a little bit harder to nail down. So, talking about horses here specifically. In doing the research for this video, I noticed that I was lacking a little bit of direction, but I was fortunate enough to come across this article that we're going to read through together from the Wild Horse Education. Now, they're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting wild horses in the United States, also the wild burros or donkeys as well. I've been aware of this organization for a while, but I find that while their hearts are in the right place, a lot of the claims that they make and the information they use is not exactly unbiased and not entirely accurate. But I don't really want to poison the well here, so let's read this article. I just thought that my own personal biases should be mentioned before we get into this. The article, or I'm not sure if it should be called an article or just a web page, but it's titled Wild or Feral, and I do have it linked down below if you want to go read it yourself as well. A wild horse or burro is classified under the United States law as a horse or burro descendants that was found on public land in 1971 after the passage of the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act of 1971. However, the term wild horse actually brings with it a fierce debate. The horse we know today, called Equus, evolved in North America. Some believe that horses brought by the Spanish repopulated the North American continent along with animals reintroduced by settlers. One of the most fascinating discoveries was that of Yukon horse, Equus lambii. This smaller, about 12 hands, evolved equid-populated Alaska, Yukon, and Northwest territories. Yukon horse resembles Przewalski's horse. The origin of the horse is not in debate, but you will often hear fierce debate using the terms feral versus argument to wild. Feral is a term used to describe a domestic animal turned wild almost exclusively to a species that is not native to an area. We use the word wild almost exclusively to refer to a native species living in a wild state. In the case of wild horses, using currently accepted science, the most appropriate technical term would be reintroduced native species. A reintroduced native species living in an environment that evolved concurrently with that species would create a harmonic wild existence. The debate rages not because of any debate of origin, it rages because of a debate on how the animals are managed on the land. Those that want the resources utilized by maintaining any wild horse or burro population use the term feral to attempt to get the animals removed from public land. The debate becomes important when you look at the different jurisdictions that manage wild horses. The legal term wild is used in the management of horses and burros managed under the Act on Bureau of Land Management land and also supposedly on Forest Service land. The term feral is used in management in Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, Fish and Wildlife, and the plan is to eradicate horses from the refuge. But in discussion of BLM and Forest Service management, the debate is entirely irrelevant. Congress declared them as a wild species to be managed as such. If Congress declared golden retrievers to be managed as a wild species, it would be the law. Many exceptions to managing any animal on public land exist. As an example, a herd of longhorn cattle is managed and preserved for its historical component to a wildlife refuge in Wichita. Domestic European cattle have absolutely no evolutionary claim, yet are managed because of their contribution to the history of European settlers in America. Here's a great book, blah, blah, blah. We're not gonna do that sentence because it's just a link to a book you can find online that I did look at. It's very old. I'm just going to put that out there. Feel free to look at it, but there are more up-to-date resources that are open access and publicly available that I have found. Here's an article published last year. One fast thought: there's no fossil record of ATV use, large-scale open pit mining, or barbed wire fence and European cows. When we talk management, we should be talking about the law, not what club do you belong to. So let's pause on the article here. I'm going to refer back to the specific paragraphs and claims that I'm going to address, since I could go paragraph by paragraph, but I don't think that would be efficient here. So as we go, again, I will refer back to the specific paragraphs, and you're more than welcome to pull it up and make sure I'm being charitable. But let this article simmer in your brain for a little bit, because now we need to talk about the one extant wild horse and a few feral populations and kind of clarify the waters here a little bit, since after that article, I think they've been muddied. So they talked a little bit about the Yukon horse, but any academic sources that you look at the minute, that's not even something that we're going to address. It's really not relevant for this conversation, and I haven't been able to find any reputable sources that even mention that as an actual horse subspecies that we need to talk about today. So just getting that one out of the way. So let's talk about the one extant wild horse. Because remember how I mentioned that of horses, there are two extant subspecies and one extinct subspecies. The extinct subspecies we're not going to go into today, but it was a wild subspecies as well. And it was native to the European area. That's as far as we're going to go into it, because we're just talking about what's alive today. So let's talk about the Przewalski wild horse. And this particular horse, their scientific name is Equus Przewalski. So they are the wild subspecies. They are native to Mongolia. There's still an active debate about whether or not they should be considered a novel species or remain a subspecies of Equus ferus. Originally, when they were described, they were a novel species, and then they were demoted to subspecies, but taxonomy is weird and it's hard to nail down species versus subspecies, especially when you do have distinct species like donkeys and horses that can interbreed and produce sterile offspring, mules and hinnies, and then you can also get donkeys and zebras and horses to interbreed. Let's not get too hung up on all that stuff. Taxonomy is weird. We're not here just to talk about taxonomy today. But we do know that the Przewalski's wild horse are at least distinct from our domesticated subspecies of horse because there has been a lot of research in the DNA sequencing. And it has determined that the Przewalski's wild horses and domesticated horses do not have the same ancestry. And they are distinct lineages, and that has to do with the number of chromosomes. One having 64 chromosomes, one having 66. They can interbreed and produce offspring with 65, which I believe are sterile as well, similar to mules. But that brings us now to domesticated horses. So Equus ferus cabalus. There are many breeds that represent feral populations. However, here are 3 examples: the American Mustang, the Chincoteague pony, and the Australian Brumby. I do apologize for not having a more diverse and global representation here, but these are 3 breeds that easily come to my brain. I know that 2 of them are North American breeds, but again, I apologize. You can pretty much go anywhere in the world and find another breed that represents feral populations of this domesticated subspecies. And again, there are many breeds. We're talking things, thoroughbreds, quarter horses, Tennessee walkers, all the fun warm bloods, draft horses, ponies. They're all the same subspecies. This is the same as my Chihuahua and my German Shepherd are very different dogs, but they're the same species of canid. They are still our domesticated dog species. So no matter how different all of these domesticated horse breeds look, they are still of that same subspecies, of the same lineage. So even these feral populations that we've mentioned, the Mustangs, the Chincoteague ponies, the Brumbies, they are all of this domesticated ancestry. Please keep that in mind. And for most of the video from here on out, I'm just going to specifically be referring to Mustangs, just because that's what the article was talking about, and it gives us a little more structure here. I've also noticed that in the US versus other countries, when they talk about their feral horse populations, like Australia seems to refer to the Brumbies as feral, and I don't see a problem with that because technically, definitionally, that's what they are. Whereas in the United States, it's almost taboo to refer to herds of Mustangs as feral, but we'll talk about that a little bit more at the ending when I wrap things up. So let's have a quick crash course on evolution and the extinction of horses in North America. And I'm sure many of you have seen images like this one, so this will be up right now and we'll talk about it in a second. But if you were to travel back to prehistoric North America about 10 million years ago, you could probably observe at least 12 species of horses trotting around. But you would notice they don't really look very much like modern horses. And the reason for this, that we know they're horses, is because the fossil record for the evolution of horses is actually very good. It's very well preserved, and they're one of these prehistoric lineages that we have a very clear understanding of. And because of that, we are able to confidently construct the timeline like the one in the image we see. which shows their little deer-like ancestors that eventually developed into the horses we see today. And yes, it is true, like the article mentioned, that horse evolution began in North America. However, what they get wrong, especially when they talk about the Yukon horse, which, again, in the academic sources that I have looked at and that I have linked down below, that particular species and or subspecies, they're kind of flippant with the terminology they used, is not mentioned. Because around 10,000 years ago, horses became extinct in the Americas. Now, there is some debate about exactly when that happened in ages of fossils. I'm going with the longer side of the estimate because it's somewhere between 10,000 to, I believe, 7,500 years. But at this point, for the sake of discussion, we're just going with a nice round 10,000 year number. And even if it's about 3,000 years less, it's not going to change the rest of the points I'm presenting to you here. So 10,000 years ago, horses became extinct in North America. There's quite a few hypotheses about why, but horses were extinct in North America. Other side of the world, not so much. And so that brings us to the late 1400s, early 1500s, when the Spanish reintroduced domesticated horses to the Americas. Now, we don't know exactly of when domesticated horses escaped and started establishing feral populations. Of course, it's not like anyone wrote it down today, the first horse ever escaped into the American prairie. But this is when horses were back on the continent with the Spaniards. And after this is when the feral populations took hold and ended up becoming a symbol of the American West. So that brings us to the question, are Mustangs actually legally wild and not feral? And this is a direct response to the assertion of paragraph 8 from the article we read a little while ago. And again, you can look at the article right now. It's linked down below to make sure I'm being charitable here. And this paragraph basically asserts that horses are legally wild, so not feral. And it doesn't make sense to be referring to them as feral because they're legally wild. Remember the golden retriever analogy. But what exactly does the law say? Well, luckily I have the PDF for that linked down below too, because it's actually pretty easy to find the text of laws. And I have clipped right here the very first opening paragraph. Now, the law itself is only about 3 pages long, and most of that is just listing out the rules and regulations for like what to do if one of these animals comes onto your private property, blah, 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 blah. But the important part is this first paragraph here. And yes, the law refers to feral Mustangs and burros as wild, free-roaming horses in burros. That's what the frickin' law is called as well. But this doesn't imply at all that they're not feral, just that they're not captive. Especially if you're thinking about the time this law was written, you would just say wild anyway, and it's not like you're gonna really care that you're being precise with your terminology. But this paragraph also goes on to say that they're not being protected solely because they're a wild animal. Again, they are domesticated feral populations technically. However, part of the reasoning for them being protected is that they are, quote, living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. And they contribute to the diversity of life forms within the nation and enrich the lives of the American people. So in short, Mustangs and burros are being protected because people want them to be, not because they are ecologically important to the North American ecosystem. So they're being protected because they have a historical value, which is similar to the herd of cattle being preserved in Wichita for historical purposes that was mentioned directly in the following paragraph, paragraph 9, that the writer here said was a bad thing. So, first of all, if that is inherently a bad thing, then it is inherently a bad thing that part of the reason to protect Mustangs and burros is for historical purposes. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, but another point is that if they were technically legally wild animals, that would, under Endangered Species Acts and things like that, would then bleed over and say that any animals of that subspecies wouldn't be able to be legally kept by private citizens. Now, I get that that's a bit of a slippery slope here, but the point I'm trying to make by really blowing this up is that legally you cannot keep a wild tiger. If these horses really are wild animals, you would not legally be able to keep them. However, you can go and adopt a Mustang today. I've worked with and ridden Mustangs before. Legally, they are protected, but that does not mean that they legally have the status of wild, not feral. You are using the name of the law and the verbiage in the law to assert that it says something that it simply does not. Now that brings us to the next question. Are Mustangs a reintroduced native species? And this is responding directly to the claim of paragraph 5, which says that exactly. And for this, we need to back up to a couple minutes ago when we talked about the evolution and extinction of horses in North America. Remember, the horse species went extinct in the Americas about 10,000 years ago, and they weren't reintroduced until about 500 years ago. So that means the ecosystem had about 9,500 years of evolution without horses. And as uncomfortable as that might make you watching this video, no, horses are not a reintroduced native species because the ecosystem had almost 10,000 years of evolution without that pressure from another very large herbivore. So yeah, at this point, they are an introduced species that could be considered naturalized, but not a reintroduced native species. Just because equines began their evolution in North America doesn't mean that if they're reintroduced after being absent for nearly 10,000 years, that's reintroducing a native species. The ecosystem has changed so much over those years, and it's adding a pressure that it didn't evolve with. You are not reintroducing a native species at this point. The species of horse that existed here would be vastly different from the one that is now here. So the horses of 10,000 years ago were not the Mustangs of today, is the point here. And I understand that makes people uncomfortable. That's also the reason I don't use the term invasive species when talking about them specifically, because of the negative connotation there. But they are a naturalized species in that they are non-native, but they are able to reproduce and survive without human intervention. And the thing about horses in general is that they are very adaptable. So that's why they're doing so well. But I digress on this point. No, they're not a reintroduced native species. The ecosystem has evolved for nearly 10,000 years without them. So at that point, it's almost an alien ecosystem to the animals. But let's move on. So why control populations of Mustangs? That was not directly talked about in the article, but alluded to. And they were getting a little aggressive about it, using words like eradicate, because these are words that they're very emotionally charged and they get people very upset. And that it just makes people think that you're going to kill something off. But let's talk about the why behind population control here. And the big why is because they're not native. just like we talked about in the last question. They're not a native species, and they do actually damage the ecosystem that hasn't evolved with them because, again, the ecosystem has not evolved with horses there for nearly 10,000 years prior to their reintroduction. And then they compete with native species like pronghorn antelope and bison. And those are some of our large herbivores that are going to kind of overlap their niches with the horses and share an environment. And because they are naturalized, their populations can and have grown beyond what is sustainable. And so that is one reason that the roundups happen to adopt the horses out to willing adopters that would like to give them a home and go through the process of training one of these Mustangs and having a future and a relationship with one of these animals, because again, they are domesticated animals. And there are also some experimentation with fertility controls that we're not really going to go into. The fertility control methods are one of the reasons why the wild horse education group, I try to stay away from them, because there's a fundamental either misunderstanding or intentional misrepresentation of what's going on there. But I digress on this point, and I may or may not expand on this and make a video about it in the future as well. We need to talk about the question here that is raised when they use words like eradicate. Now, it's not directly said in this article, but it is a common thing that I see on YouTube, a common thing that I see on Twitter, and a common narrative that's spread in this equestrian world. The question here is, does the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, directly send horses to slaughter? And I do have their website that talks about their horse programs linked down below. I understand, depending on what side of the argument you're on, you may or may not believe anything on that website. But no, they are not currently sending horses to slaughter. Now, it is true that in the early 1900s, the government rounded up and slaughtered Mustangs. That is an unfortunate reality of our history here. But today, the BLM does have policies in place to make an effort to prevent these American Mustangs from ending up in slaughter, and they don't just sell to kill buyers. Part of the contracts that you have to sign are that you're not going to knowingly send them to slaughter. Now, of course, do terrible people work the system? Do they lie on stuff like that? Yeah, unfortunately, that's going to happen, but stuff like that is going to happen no matter what. And that's not really the fault of the BLM that people work the system like that. They also have specific numbers in place, like one person cannot adopt more than 4 Mustangs. It's either in a 6-month period or in a year period. That number changes a little bit from time to time. Now, 2 people in the same family each can adopt 4, but there are things like that in place to try to prevent the mass purchase and sending of Mustangs to slaughter. So it does genuinely bother me when this narrative that the BLM just rounds up these horses and ships them over the border to be slaughtered. No, they don't. But it is really easy to villainize a government agency, and I understand that. Now, do I agree with everything the BLM does in regards to these Mustangs and burros? No. But again, I don't think they're evil, and I do think that they are made out to be evil by some activists, if only because they're a government agency. And I understand that you're not going to trust anything that's said on their website or from me defending them if you're on that side. But let's wrap things up here, because I've been going on for a while, and I do recognize that I have not addressed a lot of the claims on that webpage, and that's just because I think that the ones that I have specifically chosen to address sort of addresses the claims that they made elsewhere in the article without needing to harp on them myself. But my little conclusion here is, do I have a problem with people calling Mustangs wild horses? It may sound like I do, but actually I don't. I refer to them as wild horses in my everyday life all the time. My problem specifically is with this trend going around where it's implying that they are not domesticated, because they are. There's this misrepresentation of what domesticated is and what a domesticated animal is. And that does genuinely bother me, if only because of my specific scientific background. But I do think it's dangerous to muddy the waters of what domesticated means, which brings me to this video today. So no, I'm not going to get mad if you refer to a Mustang as a wild horse, but I am going to cringe and my feathers are going to get ruffled, so to speak, if you say, oh, my domesticated horse versus the wild horse. Very different. If that's what you're saying, then you're technically referring to the Przewalski horse, not the feral Mustangs. But I digress. I think I made that point pretty clear in this video. And because of how these terms are used scientifically and colloquially, I do think it's important to understand the difference between feral and wild populations. And while these feral horse populations are not native in places like North America, I do support their protection. I mean, it would make my day to see a herd of wild horses myself. And yes, I did just use the term wild horses referring to Mustangs. I don't have a problem with it, but just know that they are technically feral populations of the domesticated subspecies. But I do recognize the need to control their populations to protect the environment, and I understand that that makes people uncomfortable. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it today, because again, this has gotten kind of long and I've thrown a lot of information at you, but if you want more of these educational videos, I don't always ramble on and on like this. However, this video was less rambly than some of mine because I had a goal in mind. I do encourage you to please subscribe. If you have anything to say at me in the comment section, please leave it down below, whether you think that I am a cruel, heartless bitch for referring to Mustangs as feral instead of wild and free. If you think that I'm an asshole and completely wrong and sucking the government's teat because I, oh my gosh, defended the Bureau of Land Management, leave that in the comments down below too. I am actually interested in talking about why you think I'm all of these things. Or if you think that I'm just this evil person that doesn't understand horse ownership, well, you're just effing wrong there, but go off, I guess. Or if you actually learned something, please let me know that too. Leave me a like if you got through this video without calling me a dumb bitch in your head or out loud. And I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane B. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.